Museum. My name is Molly, and I manage the adult programs here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and we're just really grateful that you're here with us today. I'd like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are joining us today, because support from you is what makes us able to offer free programs like Mornings with O'Keeffe. So we thank you for your support. If you're not yet a member and you enjoy this program, consider joining and learning about all the other great benefits that a membership can offer. You can learn more by visiting gokm.org/membership. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We will try to answer as many as we can towards the end of the conversation. For the duration of the lecture, the chat has been disabled. But please note that following today's talk, a recording of the program will be made available on our website in about a week or two, once captions have been added in English and Spanish. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for this morning, Sarah Rovang. Sarah is an architectural historian and writer whose forthcoming Rizzoli book, Through the Long Desert, traces the intertwined journeys of Georgia O'Keeffe and Frank Lloyd Wright across the American landscape. Holding a Ph.D. in the history of art and architecture from Brown University, she's presented her work for the Frank Lloyd Wright Conservancy and served as a research fellow at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. Her award-winning fieldwork, supported by the Society of Architectural Historians H. Allen Brooks Fellowship, explores how modern design shapes our sense of place. She lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico with her husband and daughter, and works as a program evaluator at the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee. And we are just so glad that you're here with us today, Sarah, and I'm excited to turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. I really appreciate the kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here this morning with us. The project I'm going to be talking about today is a three-way collaboration between myself, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. So I'm deeply thankful to the support I've received from the amazing teams at the museum and the foundation over the years, including setting up events like today's. So let me get ready and share my screen here. All right. There we are. And play. Okay. All right. So the last time I gave a Mornings with O'Keeffe talk, they were still in-person events called Breakfast with O'Keeffe that happened in the old education building here in Santa Fe, which is currently a giant hole in the ground where the new O'Keeffe Museum is being built. So that should give you an idea of how long I've been working on this project. So while I'm really regretting the lack of mini muffins and coffee this morning, I'm delighted to be with you all virtually. So I wanted to give you a little bit from the book today without giving too many spoilers. And I wanted to give you a few things that didn't make it into the book. In Through the Long Desert, O'Keeffe and Wright's friendship is kind of segmented between chapters, episodically interspersed between readings of their work and the landscapes they shared. I wanted to use this talk in part to give a sense of the arc of their friendship and spend some serious time with their letters, appreciating how and what they communicated as they found inspiration in each other's work over the course of several decades. Let me first start by telling you a little bit about the project and how it came to be. Back in 2017, I was teaching at the University of Michigan. Over the summer, my husband and I were back in New Mexico, where we're both from, visiting family. My mother-in-law suggested that we attend a panel in Santa Fe on historic artist homes, featuring both Cody Hartley, who is still the director of the O'Keeffe Museum, and Stuart Graff, who was then the president and CEO of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. The panel was mostly about how to preserve and interpret homes that were also active creative sites. But during the Q&A, someone asked whether Wright and O'Keeffe knew each other. Stuart and Cody said yes, there's a stack of correspondence between them actually, just sitting in the archives, and someone should really write a book about that. So even though I'm not a Wright or O'Keeffe scholar per se, I had just finished a dissertation about the American rural landscape during the period between World War I and World War II. And I was teaching about American regional modernisms at UMich. I then did a uncharacteristically brash and foolhardy thing and volunteered myself to write this book. So thankfully, Cody and Stuart went for it, and we started thinking about how to organize a potential three-way collaboration between the O'Keeffe Museum, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and myself. I started the archival research for this book in 2019 as a research fellow at the O'Keeffe Museum. A year-long postdoc, a pandemic, a baby, and two job transitions later, and now somehow there is a book. I jumped into this project with only a hunch admittedly shared by Cody and Stuart, that there was, in fact, a book in this topic to begin with. To start, we were really only going off a couple of facts and a few uncanny resonances. First, there was the window. I would later learn that Cody and Stuart had spent the day before the panel exploring O'Keeffe's home in Abiquiu. O'Keeffe's sitting room has this rather remarkable window looking out onto a tamarisk tree in her garden. Apparently, upon seeing this view, Stuart was struck by the similarities, both spatially and in terms of framing a view, to many Wright designed homes. One of Wright's favorite devices to play with is that of compression and release. You're walking down a narrow passage with low ceilings, and suddenly the views open up. The ceilings lift, the space widens. There's a lot of evolutionary psychology about why this is so effective. Basically, humans like having the opportunity for both refuge and prospect, to retreat into a quiet cave-like space, but also to have some kind of promontory with wide open views. At any rate, O'Keeffe's living room works in a similar way. It's a long rectangular room and it opens up progressively, or at least it feels like it does, as you move toward the view at the end. And this wasn't a feature that came with the house. This was something that O'Keeffe herself intentionally designed and had installed. As a side note, it turns out that replacing adobe bricks with a picture window presents some serious structural conservation challenges. The summer that I was a research fellow at the O'Keeffe Museum, I spent a lot of time working on this window in support of the conservation management plan the museum was developing. If you want to read more about my summer of obsessing over a single window, check out my article in Southwest Contemporary from a few years back. So there was the window. Then there were the watercolors. After Cody and Stuart got back to the O'Keeffe Museum Research Center, they looked at some of the watercolors that O'Keeffe executed during her summer studies at the University of Virginia in the early 19 teens. To Stuart, O'Keeffe's style bore an uncanny resemblance to that employed by Wright and the talented renderer who worked for him during this period, Marion Mahoney. Not to mention, as I would later discover, the way that Wright himself photographed scenes in Japan during his very first visit to that country in 1905. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there was the painting. O'Keeffe very rarely made gifts of her work, but in 1946, she sent one of her paintings to Wright at his winter home and studio at Taliesin West in Scottsdale, Arizona. Other friends could count themselves lucky to receive a preparatory sketch, but here was O'Keeffe pulling out all the compositional stops on a work she ended up giving away. We'll come back to this painting in a little bit as well. So those were the points of contact I knew about going into this project, in addition to there apparently being a sizable stack of correspondence sitting at two East Coast libraries. But the more I researched, the more interesting congruencies, coincidences, and conjunctions I found. Most prominently, Wright and O'Keeffe shared a remarkable number of places and landscapes over the course of their lives. They were born 60 miles apart in southwestern Wisconsin. They both spent formative years in Chicago. They traveled to and interacted with the art and aesthetics of Japan, nursed rather conflicting feelings about New York City. And of course, they both ended up with homes in the American Southwest. Those places became the organizing conceit of this book. Cultural history became the way to keep the book grounded in the realities of highly specific places and their contexts at specific moments in time. It's very easy to just look at the formal aspects of Wright and O'Keeffe's work and find superficial and often facile connections. Historical places with their unique intellectual movements, questions, etc., became a way to interrogate the validity of these comparisons. It's really easy to see, for instance, that O'Keeffe and Wright both got really into spirals at roughly the same time in the early 1940s. It's a lot harder to unpack the overlaps and differences of what motivated this shared formal fascination. For Wright, a big part of this fascination was playing with the plasticity of concrete as a building material, which was obviously not what attracted O'Keeffe. Yet they were both looking to similar Eastern philosophical texts around this time, and both were responding to sustained time in the deserts of the American Southwest. And as we'll explore this morning, there might also be the possibility that they were influencing each other. Place and the resonance between the way Wright and O'Keeffe responded to place is really the intellectual core of the book. I wanted to write a book that someone with either an academic or non academic background could read and get something out of. Even if you've got a gajillion O'Keeffe biographies or have a stack of Frank Lloyd Wright books on your coffee table, there are new archival finds in this book that I think are going to surprise you and make you think about these two figures in a new light. But alongside that more formal art historical narrative of parallel approaches to abstracting nature and place sits a more emotional story, the story of Wright and O'Keeffe's friendship. Each of the chapters draws on and quotes from the letters that they wrote to each other over approximately 15 years, from 1933 to 1947. I have endeavored to let their voices come through strongly throughout the text, to give their words space to breathe. Perhaps more importantly, I've tried to frame their conversations with each other to show how they related to one another and how they drew on ideas from each other and used those ideas in their own medium. I want to be clear up front. Wright and O'Keeffe were not besties or even close friends in the way that we think of those terms today. Compare the roughly 24 letters that O'Keeffe and Wright exchanged to the over 5,000 letters between O'Keeffe and her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, and you can quickly understand that this was a relationship on a different scale. But I think there is room in art historical narratives for other kinds of friends and an expanded definition of artistic partnership. If art or architectural historians write about two creators alongside each other, it's more often about romantic partnerships or people who worked in very close collaboration in the same medium. Maybe they were part of the same artistic movement or produced formally similar work, as was the case with O'Keeffe and Arthur Dove. Maybe they were part of the same codified school or group. But I think we've undervalued the role of other kinds of influence and exchange. One of the things I became very interested in with this book was not only looking at Frank and George's friendship with each other, but the larger social network in which they were enmeshed. I never ended up using this diagram in my book, so this is a working document, screenshot and quote me at your own risk. But I did want to share this as kind of a quick visual to show all of their mutual friends, acquaintances, professional nemesis. And this started as kind of an abstract intellectual exercise, but I do think it reveals the extent to which, even by the early 20th century, how ideas and patterns of thought spread across the country. Let me give you just one kind of fun example. This is our 6 degrees of separation with O'Keeffe and Wright. So in the 1920s, Frank Lloyd Wright is working out of Los Angeles. One of his apprentices is a young Austrian architect named Richard Neutra, who ends up doing the landscape design for the famous Hollyhock House that Wright designs, among other things. Neutra goes on to become a really seminal California modernist. One of his best known houses is for Grace Miller. Miller's house, with all of its high ceilings and big transparent passages, is specifically designed for her profession, which is in part teaching the Messendiac system. Developed by an American physician named Bess Messendiac, this is a set of ergonomic exercises that's typically performed in the nude while looking in a mirror. It was kind of a niche thing that had a cult following among largely educated women, one of whom was Georgia O'Keeffe. So, this is just to give you an example of all of these strange and fascinating ways that O'Keeffe and Wright were connected besides their direct connection to one another. And I could tell you many other stories along the same line if you're interested. But one of the things that was really fascinating to me as I was writing this book was thinking through other models of friendship and how those relate to patterns of creative exchange. How did people relate to each other in the past, and how does that maybe look different from how we form relationships today? And what might we take from those older historical models to think about how we relate to our friends? I was already well into the editing process when I read a book that really changed the way I was thinking about Through the Long Desert. Raina Cohen's wonderful The Other Significant Others gave me the emotional framework I needed to really clarify what I was hoping readers would take away, not just as fans of art and architecture, but as people in relationship to other people. Cohen's book starts with a historical examination of friendship in earlier periods of human history. Friendships in other periods, I would say, could be a lot closer. Some societies even had formal structures under which friends could legally declare their connection to each other and rituals through which to formalize that connection, sometimes in ceremonies that look quite like modern weddings. The biggest recent shift, though, I think came in the 1950s. McCarthyism and the accompanying wave of homophobia, do you recall the Lavender Scare, fundamentally changed the way same sex friendships look and can be expressed, at least publicly. If you've spent much time reading letters from the pre 1950s period, you probably already have a sense of this. Friends from earlier periods were much more effusive and forthright in their correspondence, willing to express the fullness of their emotions for each other. You might reflexively say, I love you at the end of phone calls with a spouse, parent, or child, but how often do you do that with your friends? Now, couching same sex attraction and sexual love as friendship was an important way for queer folks of the past to pass and fit in. And I don't want to gloss over or undervalue those histories. I merely want to point out that there were plenty of folks who would have identified as straight today who spent a lot of time writing gushy romantic letters to their same sex friends. O'Keeffe and her friends certainly expressed themselves in this way. The idea of romantic friendship has been a victim of big cultural shifts in the last century, but also the idea that our primary romantic partner has to be our soulmate and play all of the big major relational roles in our life. Marriage has gone from being a primarily economic contract to one expected to fill most social goals in our life. But as Cohen puts it, in antiquity and the early modern period, family, friend, and spouse were not ranked in clear hierarchy. And a friend could take on roles we now assume that would only go to a relative or spouse. By the same token, I think opposite sex friendships have likewise been impoverished over the last century. And here we get back to Wright and O'Keeffe. There are certainly lines in the O'Keeffe Wright letters that are very emotionally vulnerable, maybe even a tinge romantic. If not overly flirtatious, there are certainly some passages that are a little coy. Even if their friendship, as far as any surviving documentary evidence shows, was purely friendship, their report is still maybe a little outside of how typical married opposite sex friends interact today. So this book got me thinking about how the Wright and O'Keeffe book could not be only hopefully, I mean, interesting and beautiful, but in some ways useful to contemporary readers. How can other models of being in relationship and creative partnership remain relevant today? So now I want to kind of transition to giving the arc of that friendship and maybe unpacking a little bit what that friendship actually looked like and what O'Keeffe and Wright gave to each other over the course of their correspondence. So Wright and O'Keeffe most likely knew each other before he wrote to her for the first time in 1933. They had overlapping exhibitions up at the Anderson Galleries in New York City in 1927. The painting on the left was one of those shown at that, though for very different reasons. Wright, saddled with debts and still trying to build back a flagging career, was selling off a slew of his Japanese print collection. O'Keeffe, who was around age 40 at the time and quickly rising through the ranks of well-known American painters, was having her annual show at her husband Alfred Stieglitz's gallery. So while I don't have any proof, I think it's pretty likely that they met then. In 1931, Wright stopped into Stieglitz's gallery while in New York to give a lecture. Stieglitz's account of the visit to O'Keeffe is chatty, like they all kind of inhabit the same social circle. Wright sends his greetings to Georgia at this visit, which to me seems to imply that they already had met at some point prior. The first documentation of their relationship comes in 1933, when Wright writes to O'Keeffe asking her to join forces with him in the creation of the Taliesin Fellowship. Wright had written to a variety of his other famous friends with the same proposition, but his letter to O'Keeffe is the most formal, the most flowery. Looking for you as the great American painter to join forces with me in the Taliesin Fellowship. We should expect you to go on working on your own work in your own way, here in a studio we have. And we would build you a little place of your own on the hillside above the fellowship, which would be sacred to you, and as you wanted to have it. Carrying on your own work independently, you could take such an interest in the youth here as interested you, and assist a gradual development in our apprentices of some sense of painting as you know, feel it and know it. No arduous task. No teaching, but engendering something by your own presence and fine example. Now, this was a rough time for O'Keeffe. She had just failed to complete a big mural commission at Radio City Music Hall, and on top of that, Stieglitz was increasingly embroiled in an extramarital affair. So she's dealing with some major mental health struggles and is actually recovering in Bermuda when Wright's invitation reaches her. So she demurs, saying, "I will write you sometime after the middle of May when I am back on real land and feeling better." But Wright is not going to be deterred. He pulls out his most persuasive power and all of his charm in his next letter. As our first and foremost American painter in the search of the beauty of truth, you belong here with the fellowship in this design of the living arts. You won't be far from home if you come. You'll be free to work. Comradeship in the best sense will be yours, and you will be an inspirational force in America's growth with more immediate force and effect even than ever. I am sure of your spirit and the ultimate value of your person to the fellowship. You seem to me to be utterly trustworthy. I can't say as much for myself, although I feel trustworthy too. I was more than merely glad to know that you were on the upward wing again. But O'Keeffe puts him off again. She's back recovering at Lake George by this point. All I can say to you is that I am not well enough to be of any use to anyone. It will still probably be months before I can count on being much of a person. I guess I have not written sooner because I dislike having to own up to such a way of being. Over the next 10 years, Wright is moving into the next major act of his career, starting the Taliesin Fellowship, sadly without O'Keeffe, and building Taliesin West in Scottsdale. The house called Falling Water cements Wright not just as a revered has-been, but as an architect who is still culturally relevant and in many ways cutting edge. O'Keeffe starts going to New Mexico on a yearly basis and makes a full recovery after the difficulties of the early 1930s. During this decade, Wright reaches out to Stieglitz a few times about various projects, making sure to send his love to Georgia and invite them both to visit at Taliesin. Despite the lack of written correspondence over the intervening years, O'Keeffe feels moved to write to the architect in 1942, offering to finally come see him at Taliesin while she's out in Wisconsin to receive an honorary doctoral degree and to visit her family. Wright gladly accepts. And here's a little tidbit that didn't make it into the book. In his response, Wright asks O'Keeffe to bring a picture that he had forgotten, assumably at Stieglitz's gallery during a visit to New York. O'Keeffe apologizes. She can't find the painting, thinks she might have painted on the back of it, as she did sometimes. But this is our earliest indication that O'Keeffe was either planning to give or sell a painting to Wright. So on June 2nd, 1942, O'Keeffe spent the afternoon at Taliesin, where she likely spent time in the formal drawing room with some of Wright's impressive collection of Asian art, overlooking what Wright called the Welsh hills of his family's land. Now, we can never know exactly what transpired nor what they talked about, but we can get a sense of this visit's importance to O'Keeffe from the letter that she wrote to him afterwards. I'm going to pause for just a few minutes so that we can all collectively decipher O'Keeffe's handwriting together. Just kidding. Here's some of the transcription. Dear Frank Lloyd Wright, I wish I could tell you how much the hours with you mean to me. I've thought of you most of my waking hours since I left your house, and I assure you that I left with a keen sense of regret. Last night in the hotel in Chicago, my sister got on to Cleveland to meet her husband. I got out your book. I read the part marked with the red line at the end, then started at the beginning and read to the end of the first evening, stopping often to think about it, always relating what you give me to painting, to what I want to do. And you may smile when I say to you that I thought seriously of taking the train back to Madison to visit you again. I thought too, if I had offered you one of my best paintings years ago, maybe you would have taken it. I remember then so long ago. That was what I wanted to do, even though I did not know you then as I know you now. I felt I should offer you my best, but I knew Alfred would make a great stir if I started doing things like that. I have always said to him that I think I should give things away, that it might be all right. And he always said, yes, it would be if you were alone, but it wouldn't be while I'm around. Since I visited you, I know that my feeling was right for me. Two together aren't the same as one apart. As I think over this whole trip, the hours with you are the only part of it that I feel really add to my life. I salute you and go on to the second evening of your book with very real thanks. Will you give a very quiet greeting and thanks to the beautiful wife, Georgia? I want to highlight two passages from this rather remarkable letter in particular. First, that O'Keeffe says that she takes what Wright gives her and applies it to painting. The book that Wright gives her that night is really a summation of his career to date, and the part that he has highlighted for her isn't even about architecture, it's about politics and Wright's conception of democracy. But for Wright and O'Keeffe, importantly, art, architecture, politics, clothing, furniture is all part of the same continuum of modern living. And second, she references again the desire to give Wright a painting that was truly one of her best. So she follows through this time, likely over objections from Stieglitz. In 1943, she paints the work that I referenced earlier, Pelvis with Shadows and the Moon. She started painting it in New Mexico, where her friend Maria Chabot saw an early version, and then she finished it in New York. She wrote to Chabot from New York in November. Yesterday, I started on my big pelvis painting, painted over most of it. Let Alfred see it last night for the first time. He likes it very much, remarks, well, that is certainly exciting, but it isn't at all what you saw. When O'Keeffe painted this work, it was the third largest canvas she had painted to date and brought together multiple compositional devices and motifs that the artist was working with at the time. Oftentimes, when O'Keeffe combined multiple motifs into a single large painting, those works were ones with particularly strong emotional resonance. Just to give you another example, the very large work entitled Spring, which was painted in 1948, is typically read as an homage to Alfred Stieglitz, who had passed away 2 years earlier. Note how O'Keeffe is drawing together a bunch of her favorite motifs into a single composition, kind of in a similar way to what she's doing in Pelvis with Shadows and the Moon. So what's going on with this painting? Unlike some of O'Keeffe's other pelvises, which you've probably seen, where you just see the hole in the pelvis and then the white circle of bone, very minimalist. Here we've got a lot going on. There's the whole pelvis bone and all of its distinctive anatomical glory. It's floating over this mysterious set of color fields that are simultaneously landforms and shadows. We're not sure what's field, what's ground, what's the subject of the painting. Up in the corner, we've got an oversized moon. This is a feature in a lot of Japanese woodblock prints, which is a medium that both Wright and O'Keeffe collected and personally enjoyed quite a bit. And we've got the ubiquitous Pedernal, the mountain visible from O'Keeffe's house at Ghost Ranch that she painted dozens of times over the course of her career, and that you can see on the cover of the book. So yeah, I'm not gonna lie, there's a lot going on in this painting, and we haven't even gotten to what is happening at the bottom of the painting. This painting feels, on the whole, very Southwest, very New Mexico, except for this kind of weird aberration. There's this greenish black form that you do not typically see both either these colors or these shapes in O'Keeffe's paintings of the Southwest. This is more of a color that you would see in her paintings of Lake George, maybe of Maine. Um, I don't think it's Lake George or Maine, though. I think it's Wisconsin. And I think it's Wright's beloved Welsh hills, the same ones O'Keeffe would have seen from his living room sitting that afternoon at Taliesin. My theory here is that O'Keeffe is bringing together her sacred landscape with Wright's. So O'Keeffe finishes this work in 1943, and it goes on view in Stieglitz's gallery in 1944 as part of her annual show. I feel pretty confident that O'Keeffe painted this work with Wright in mind and planned to give it to him at the outset. But it has to stay in New York because it's being considered for inclusion in the artist's big career retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. In 1946, Wright goes to see that show and writes, "I went in to see your fine show at the Modern, expecting to see my painting, listed alone by the kindness of Frank Lloyd Wright, but it wasn't there." O'Keeffe, who at the time was also mourning the loss of Stieglitz, worked to get the painting properly reframed, removing the heavy gold frame and glass that had been on it and replacing those with a simple metal frame. O'Keeffe even used the same dark green paint to extend the landform at the bottom of the painting around and onto the frame. When Wright received it, he wrote, the masterpiece arrived properly framed. That is to say, none showing. We have it against a gray stone wall next to the fireplace in our little playhouse, where it plays a great part in the desert ensemble. That letter, coincidentally, is the final piece of correspondence we have between Wright and O'Keeffe. We do have documentation in O'Keeffe's letters that she went to visit Taliesin West in 1949 and likely again in 1951 when she was out seeing friends in Arizona. And I have to thank Barbara Bueller Lyons here for helping surface the letters showing that O'Keeffe actually visited. However, because we don't have the corresponding documentation on the right side, we don't know whether the painter visited while Wright was in town or if she merely went out for a tour of the buildings and property. A frustrating part of being a historian of the 20th century is the pesky existence of the telephone. We have no way of knowing if Wright and O'Keeffe arranged multiple visits to each other in the intervening years, of which we have no written record. But the conversation between them, I would argue, hardly stops in 1947 with the arrival of O'Keeffe's painting. The next year, Wright starts work on a retail space for an upscale gift shop in San Francisco. It's always hard to prove causation when all we have to work with is correlation, but I think there's more than mere coincidence in the formal similarities between Pelvis with Shadows in the Moon and the V.C. Morris gift shop. In fact, it was this juxtaposition of photograph and painting that initially persuaded Cody and Stewart that there was a book here indeed to be written. This is a comparison I delve much more deeply into and through the long desert, looking at their shared fascination with Eastern philosophy during the early 1940s. But suffice it to say, this is Wright at perhaps his most animalistic and anatomical, a far cry from the more botanical structures he tends to draw on. Isn't there something bone-like and biomorphic about the interior of this building? And if we needed further proof that Wright found inspiration in O'Keeffe's work, all we have to do is look to the fact that he brought the painting with him to New York when he was working on the Guggenheim Museum. For several years, Wright routinely occupied a suite at the Plaza Hotel that was jokingly dubbed Taliesin 3 or Taliesin East. As he was accustomed to doing every time he stayed at a hotel, Wright restyled the suite to make it suit his own tastes. Here we see O'Keeffe's painting leaned against a board upon which the architect has also penned a section and rendering of Price Tower, the only skyscraper that he ever built, and a Belgian Gothic cathedral. I am self-consciously glossing over dozens of essays and books on the design of the Guggenheim here, but can you think of a better summation of this building than of a towering cathedral with the swooping skeletal curves of O'Keeffe's painting? Years later, after Wright had passed away and O'Keeffe was busy cementing her legacy with career retrospectives, the painter entertained the idea of mounting an exhibition of her abstract works at the Guggenheim. As historian Barbara Rose recalled, Miss O'Keeffe was amused at having a show at what she called Lloyd Wright's museum. The show, unfortunately, never came to pass. And without giving too many spoilers, I also hypothesize in the book that O'Keeffe's 1960 painting of Mount Fuji may in fact be a subtle homage to Wright, who passed away in 1959. But here's where I do the frustrating thing of telling you that if you want to know the whole story, you're going to have to read the book. And if you want to see Mount Fuji on view at the O'Keeffe Museum, you have just a few days to do so before the current exhibition comes down. So in closing, I'd invite you to think about if there's anyone in your own life who is a constant, steady presence, whose work inspires and nourishes your own, but perhaps years pass in between contact with them. But you know that whenever you do reconnect with this person, you do so with a foundational shared understanding of the world we live in, that you can essentially pick up where you left off, and that no matter where your lives or careers go in the interim, that you will leave a conversation with this person having gained something interesting, fresh, and vital. That, to paraphrase O'Keeffe's thank you letter to Wright after visiting his home in Taliesin, that something has been added to your life. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this. I do have a couple of events and other ways to stay in touch if you're interested that I would like to go through before we get to the all-important questions from our audience. So the first thing I've been doing for this book is a bi-weekly newsletter called Desert Dispatch that you can sign up for on my website at sarahrovang.com/dispatches. And I've been sharing snippets that haven't made it into the book, archival finds that folks might find interesting, and I'm also keeping everyone apprised of upcoming events. Speaking of upcoming events, at the O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe this Friday, we've got a First Fridays event coming up. It's themed around tea. I will be out in the courtyard signing books, and I'll be giving a brief gallery talk around 6 p.m., talking about some of the resonances between Wright, O'Keeffe, the Book of Tea, and everything you need to know about Taoist aesthetics in 15 minutes. I also have another talk coming up next weekend at Taliesin in Wisconsin at their beautifully new restored hillside theater called Imagining Midwestern Landscapes. I cut an entire mini chapter out of the book because it was kind of esoteric about O'Keeffe and Wright and Barnes. So I'm excited to share some of that material in a very site-specific and intimate setting. I also have events the next 2 days in Dubuque and the Quad Cities if you're interested, and we'll be in the Midwest at that time. I'll get everything up on my website momentarily so folks can see. And then finally, I'll be out at Taliesin West in Scottsdale on October 23rd as part of their Sunsets and Sips event. I'll be out in the garden room in conversation with folks and signing books. I would love to see some of you all there. I am continuing to add more events to our little miniature impromptu book tour, and you can keep up to date with those at sarahrovang.com/events. So thank you all. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone this morning and looking forward to hearing your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. I feel like I learned so much in a very short period of time, which is the nature of these, but it mostly makes me just want to learn even more. I want to share with the audience today that I'm also really enjoying the book. I think you will as well. And to remind you that the Friday event here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, it's free and open to the public as a part of our First Friday program. So definitely swing by if you're in the area. You will not be disappointed and you get a chance to talk with Sarah yourself. But let's go ahead and turn to questions, which always pour in at the end. So we'll do our very, very best to answer as many as possible, but we will start with the Pelvis painting, Shadows in the Moon, that eventually became a possession of Frank Lloyd Wright's. Where is it now?
It is with a private collector.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's see. Another question. We have a question from Karen who's asking if you wouldn't mind to go back in your presentation to the social relationship diagram that you
Oh,
created.
sure. Yeah.
She says
Yeah. Let me
it's
get that back out.
fascinating. I also found it very fascinating, and it's so interesting to map a social milieu. And
Yeah,
yeah,
let
just a
me
chance to look at
share
that a
my
little more
screen
closely.
again. Here we go. All right. There you are. And I'm sure there are plenty that I have not captured here. These were just the ones that kind of came up that were related in some way to the research for the book.
Yeah, there's just so many familiar names that it's astounding to know that they were mutual acquaintances or somehow overlapped. Are there any other names appearing here on this map or in your research that maybe were surprising to you, or something you want to dig in further, maybe for future research?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the link between George Gurdjieff, who was kind of this mystic spiritual leader. He had so many like connections in the United States. So Jean Toomer, who was very close with O'Keeffe for a while, big Harlem Renaissance writer, very important figure, had met Frank Lloyd Wright several times through the Gurdjieff connection. And they, had dinner together and gone to plays together. And so that was one I found really fascinating. I also I learned this visiting a Wright's American system built homes. I always forget how that goes, but in Milwaukee, he designed these kind of affordable houses. And the novelist Sherwood Anderson, who later became really good friends with O'Keeffe, did the like advertising copy for those houses. And that was something that like you only learn if you're doing the site visits and talking to the local historians who have done all of this research themselves.
Amazing. We have a couple questions delving deeper into these mutual acquaintances. Gigi is wondering if you could expand any more about the connection that Isamu Noguchi might have between the two. Okay.
Yeah. So I while I was at the Avery Library at Columbia, I pulled all of Isamu Noguchi's correspondence with Wright, and it was absolutely fascinating. Noguchi during World War II, voluntarily went to a Japanese internment camp. As a second generation Japanese American, he was not required to, but he felt as an act of solidarity that he had to do that, and he got stuck there. And I have not been able to substantiate this story, but I have found in a couple of Noguchi biographies and other sources the story that Wright was actually one of the people who helped get him back out, who advocated for him. Um, and then Noguchi also came to visit Wright at Taliesin in Wisconsin after the war. And they were talking about doing some kind of project together in New York, some kind of artistic architectural collaboration that never came to fruition, but it's clear from their letters that they really admired each other and connected with each other. Noguchi and O'Keeffe got close later in O'Keeffe's life after Wright had already passed away. There are some fabulous photos on the Noguchi Archives website of him visiting her out at Ghost Ranch in Abiquiu, like at the White Place. Really recommend for folks to go check that out because they're really sweet photos, and you can see some of his designs still in her Abiquiu house. Some of the paper lanterns are his design.
Amazing. Thank you so much for expanding on that a little bit more. Someone wanted to confirm the Harlem Renaissance author connection. I believe that was Jean Toomer that you were referring
Mhm.
to earlier. Okay, so that
Yes.
just for that person who wanted that quick recap. We also have questions about, I'm amazed by how many questions we have about how many other people they knew mutually, which I think to me just shows how fascinating it truly is to think of both of these figures in the broader context of other creatives, other artists, other
Right.
authors, that truly we perhaps mistakenly can think of each of them as being these like independent powerhouses of their respective media, but truly they're part of a huge community. I think people are very interested in this. We have questions about Calder, if you had found anything in your research about Alexander Calder being a mutual friend or acquaintance.
I have not, but I wouldn't discount it. Both of these figures have so much in their respective correspondence archives that I couldn't look at anything. So I would not be surprised if Calder was on Wright's radar screen.
Great, so we'll have to stay tuned for further evidence there. Okay, let's turn back to some of these more O'Keeffe and Wright relationships. We have a question from Lynn asking if you know if Wright ever visited Georgia O'Keeffe in Abiquiu.
That is a great question. Thank you, Lynn. We don't have any archival documentation to show that. We do know that when Wright and his apprentices would go across the country every year, they would kind of spend their summers in Wisconsin and then winters in Scottsdale. So they would try to take different routes each time they made that trip. And we do have documentation from an apprentice's account that they would occasionally stop in Abiquiu, and that sort of knowing that O'Keeffe was there and that she was drawing on that landscape was really important to the apprentices, and they got a lot out of that visit. No idea whether they actually stopped there or not, and actually went and saw O'Keeffe O'Keeffe at her house, but we know that the whole Wright apprentice contingent did go through Abiquiu at some points.
Great. Oh, that's so interesting to know that. Let's see. Okay, Steve has an interesting question about the nature of the letter writing between O'Keeffe and Wright. So many of us who love O'Keeffe and study her work are also familiar with her iconic handwriting.
Mhm.
With Frank Lloyd Wright's letters to O'Keeffe, were those handwritten letters as well, or were they typewritten, or what was kind of his style of writing back?
That is a really great question. He often, what I would find in the archives is that he would hand draft it and then he would type on the other side. And then he would like do a fresh copy, I think, or like hand it off to his secretary. Um, and so there are a couple where he's like thinking out through what he's going to say to her, and then you get the typewritten final on the other side. So it's fun to see his process. And there's one that like absolutely breaks my heart, and I don't know that I can like, I'm going to try to tell you about it without crying. But so after Stieglitz dies, Wright writes to her a sympathy letter. And many folks who are familiar with Wright probably know that he um, lost a lot of people in a very violent act earlier in his life. His partner and her children and several of his apprentices were all murdered at Taliesin. And the way that he got through that was getting back to work and really um, kind of diving back into his work, going off to Japan and doing the Imperial Hotel. So when he writes to O'Keeffe after Stieglitz's death, he hand types this, or he typewrites this letter that basically says like, I'm really glad to know that you're out in New Mexico and back at work. It's the only recourse for sorrow. And then in pen in hand, he writes next to that, I know, period. And it just gets me every time. So I feel like he, it was never like just his secretary sending these letters for him. It was always like from him personally, and he like had a hand in all of it.
Wow, that is such a powerful story, and to be able to pick up more insight from the physical objects of the letters, not just the words, but how they were written. Oh, wow. I can see why that story is
Yeah.
sticking with you so strong. Let's see. We got time for a few more. We do have questions coming through about the First Friday event and the availability of the book at the O'Keeffe Museum gift shop. So there will be books available in the gift shop after this event. So this is something that will be stocked here regularly. But uh, maybe, I don't know if there will be any signed copies available for purchase, and if you're planning on signing some to have, or after the event, or some extras that people might
Yeah.
be lucky enough to get.
I I am, yes, I'm happy to hang out and sign more copies so that the O'Keeffe Museum has a stock of them. Um, I mean, I don't know how you feel about me repping other bookstores in Santa Fe, but if you like need one today, Collected Works has some signed copies as well.
No, we love collective work, so definitely. So everyone who's asking about that, and also you can visit our website and contact our retail shop manager if you have any specific questions about how you can get your hands on a copy if you're not local, and we will be sure to help you as best we can. We have another question, another friendship question. Do we know if Frank Lloyd Wright had any sort of relationship with Ansel Adams the way that O'Keeffe knew Ansel Adams?
That's a great question. And I don't know. I have not found anything about that. Yeah, I think, the landscapes they inhabited are a little bit distinct, but I wouldn't be surprised if they'd run into each other at some point. There are certainly, to the question of photographers, there were a lot of photographers who knew both Wright and O'Keeffe and photographed them both, which is really cool.
Very, yes, it's neat to see the photographs that chronicle all of these relationships as well. Let's see. Gosh, it's at this point they come in so quickly. I'm doing my very best to kind of group them together. We do have a question. Okay, we have a question from Tom, who wonders, he would like to hear a little bit more about that window that you dealt with when you were a fellow, and if there's anything you want to add about
Oh,
what that project was like and how it formed your future
thank you.
project.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking about the window, Tom. Um, Yeah, so one of the great mysteries about this window was that it was really hard to date it. We couldn't figure out, we knew it was like roughly in the early 1960s sometime, but using dated photographs, it was really hard to narrow down that range. And so figuring out what O'Keeffe was doing, like artistically, what might have motivated her at any given point to do this really drastic thing to her living room, because there was a much more modest window there previously. There was sort of a much smaller aperture. And I totally lucked out. This was a like I had been searching for months trying to find some archival documentation about when this window had been created. And I was at the point where I was at the Beinecke at Yale, just pulling their miscellaneous folders in hopes of running across something. And that is where I found the receipt for O'Keeffe buying some of the materials in 1964 that were used in that window. So we know that like at least the materials for the window were purchased in 1964. So that's our current best guess of when she opted to do that. But it's really, interesting. You can find very similar windows at her friend Alexander Gerard's house. He also has a big picture window that frames a tamarisk tree. She would have visited that before doing this to her own house. I have no idea if she was ever out to Walter Gropius's house. Um, on the East Coast, but he also has this fabulous picture window with the Saarinen womb chair sitting right in front of it, framing this tremendous view of a tree. So I feel like she would have had a lot of modern design inspiration for doing this to her living room.
Very cool. And for anyone who's had a chance to visit the Holman studio, it's such an experience to see this beautiful panoramic view. It truly wraps you up and makes you feel very happy inside. Okay, we have a question from Stephen who wonders, and you had mentioned a little bit, it's difficult to trace every type of correspondence with the phone and these other things, but do we know at what point and why the letters between the two may have stopped, or when the correspondence kind of ended?
That's a really good question. I mean, so the story that I would like to believe is that the painting gets to Taliesin West. Wright hangs it up. Then he gets really busy with the Guggenheim. The painting comes with him to New York. He's in his 80s by this point. He spends the last decade of his career really immersed in doing the Guggenheim and a bunch of other projects. He's still very creatively prolific during this period. So I'm thinking he was largely busy. But I also do think that they probably, if because she did go visit him or visit Taliesin West in 1949, I like to think that they stayed in touch, and she does stay in touch with his widow Oglavana after he passes away, even though at times she kind of makes it clear that she would sort of like the painting back, maybe. Um, um, but she does sort of keep in touch with Wright's sphere and his family after he passes away.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's see. So I like to close out these conversations with just a general comment, and from the audience. And I'm scrolling through and seeing, many people just thanking you for your time. So excited to learn about your research. Lots more questions about folks who want to know more about these mutual friendships. And I will remind those people that perhaps this could be a personal research project for you. You could visit us at the Research Center and take a look at the archives and see where some of these things meet. If you have some burning questions, you're always welcome to come. But I will close with this comment that this person shares, "It was brave and insightful of you to frame the book in terms of other friendships. It really takes us both specifically to Georgia and Frank, but also into our own relationships and into the relationships between other well-known figures and the impact those connections have," which is so wonderful. And I think that is such a beautiful way to frame this story, because we have people in our lives who make tremendous impacts in ways that are immeasurable. And this is just a really fascinating one to get to dive into, thanks to your research. So we really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. This was such a lovely break from my regular workday.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you being here. And reminder to everyone about these upcoming events. Sarah is clearly very busy, so we're grateful that you had time to squeeze us in this morning. Come see us on Friday. And if you have any questions about getting a copy of the book, feel free to send an email to us at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and we'll be happy to set you up there. But in the meantime, we hope to see you at the next event next month. And in between now and then, have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you, Molly.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.